Hello. 2025 marks the centennial of the Scopes Trial, focusing on creationism, quite reasonably, at a time in which all of science is under threat. But be that as it may, what I want to do for the next few minutes is focus on something else that came out of the Scopes Trial, namely the question of morality, although of course not the way the fundamentalist Christians were framing it. Let's start with the big international story of the decade before the Scopes Trial, namely World War I. So it's 1916 and it's World War I in Europe. That was the worst war of all time up to that point, the war to end all wars. The leading evolutionary biologist in Europe is Ernst Haeckel, and he publishes a book called World War I and What It Will Take to Make Peace from the Perspective of Darwinian Evolution. The New York Times publishes an excerpt, and Haeckel seems to speak for both Darwin and Germany. At all events, when the Treaty of Peace is concluded, we must demand a considerable extension of the German Empire. In making this demand, our motive is neither the greed nor the lust for gold that dominates England, who rules the world, nor the vain national pride of France with its mania for glory, nor the childish megalomania of Rome-crazy Italy, nor the insatiable hankering for territorial expansion of semi-barbarous Russia. It is simply this, that the German Empire, being overpopulated, has urgent need to extend and strengthen its frontiers, which were most unfavorable for it before the war. Well, just basic population pressure, which leads to competition, which leads to natural selection, which leads to a sort of biological nirvana. It is true that the progress of civilization, which we should like to have continued unbroken, has suffered 1,000 regrettable interruptions by the unavoidable horrors of the present war, and has led to painful relapses into barbarism. Yet, all in all, the beneficial progress of evolution outweighs the injurious effects of the regressive development during the war. The average course which the history of humanity and the evolution of all organic life follows is like the famous Echternach dancing processions, 3 steps forward, 2 steps backward. And you must look up Echternach dancing profession on Wikipedia. Bottom line, war is good, so suck it up, losers. Of course, the US hasn't entered the war yet. Meanwhile, the US is still neutral, but as part of a relief effort in Belgium, biologist Vernon Kellogg gets to hang out and do some reconnoitering in the German High Command. The result was a bestseller called Headquarters Nights, in which Kellogg begins by noting that his host, given the pseudonym Professor von Flussen, has some weird-ass ideas about evolution. Professor von Flussen, that is not his name, is a biologist. So am I. So we talked out the biological argument for war, and especially for this war. The captain professor has a logically constructed argument why, for the good of the world, there should be this war. After all, Haeckel has already outlined it. Professor von Flussen is a neo-Darwinian, as are most German biologists and natural philosophers. The creed of the omnipotence of a natural selection based on violent and fatal competitive struggle is the gospel of the German intellectuals. All else is illusion and anathema. But wait, there's more. This struggle not only must go on, for that is the natural law, but it should go on, so that this natural law may work out, in its cruel, inevitable way, the salvation of the human species. By its salvation is meant its desirable natural evolution. That human group which is in the most advanced evolutionary stage as regards internal organization and form of social relationship is best, and should, for the sake of the species, be preserved at the expense of the less advanced, the less effective. It should win in the struggle for existence, and this struggle should occur precisely that the various types may be tested, and the best not only preserved, but put in position to impose its kind of social organization, its Kultur, over all the others, or alternatively to destroy and replace them. This is the disheartening kind of argument that I faced at headquarters. But wait, there's more. Professor von Flussen is sure that Germany's way is the right way, and that the biologic evolutionary factors are so all-controlling in determining human destiny that this being biologically right is certain to ensure German victory. If the wrong and unnatural alternative of an Allied victory should obtain, then he would prefer to die in the catastrophe and not have to live in a world perversely resistant to natural law. And now the bad news. A lot more people read Ernst Haeckel than read Vernon Kellogg, or Charles Darwin, but that's a story for another day. Flash forward, now it's just a few years later. It's 1925, and Tennessee has passed a manifestly unconstitutional law prohibiting the teaching of evolution, or any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. And the town of Dayton, Tennessee volunteers itself to the ACLU to provide a test case, and they duly arrest a local substitute school teacher named John Scopes for the ostensible crime of teaching evolution. They were all friends. This was just political theater. Then William Jennings Bryan, the leading orator and political icon in the country, three-time Democratic candidate for president, a fundamentalist Christian, and a staunch pacifist about World War I, who heard the evolutionary rationalizations from the other side, volunteers to assist the prosecution. Clarence Darrow, the leading trial attorney in the land, volunteers for the defense. And the game is on. The trial of John T. Scopes in July of 1925 was a huge media circus, pitting the values of urban, cosmopolitan, progressive America against the values of rural, southern Christian fundamentalists. Not only that, but it was broadcast on the radio, so the whole nation heard it. Creationism and the Bible and tradition versus evolution and modernity and progress. Several excellent books have been written about it. Bryan dramatically defends the Bible against the cross-examination by Darrow. The jury finds Scopes to be guilty, and the judge fines Scopes $100, which the jury was supposed to do, so that was consequently the basis of a successful appeal a bit later. William Jennings Bryan drops dead a few days later, a fact with absolutely no theological implications, although perhaps they should have been considered. John Scopes went on to work in geology and had a nice life, even turning up on the 1960s game show To Tell the Truth, in which he fooled absolutely no one on the panel.
One of these men was the defendant in the most famous court trial of this century. What is your name, please?
My name is John Thomas Scopes.
What is your name, please?
My name is John Thomas Scopes.
What is your name, please?
My name is John Thomas Scopes.
Two of these people are imposters. Only one is the real John Thomas Scopes, and is the only one sworn to tell the truth. Will the real John Thomas Scopes please stand up? Well done,
It's like meeting an historical monument.
And now the detour. Clarence Darrow did something unusual during the trial. Namely, he actually read the textbook out of which John Scopes was accused of teaching. and what he found there appalled him, even more than it appalled the creationists. Sure, the book covered the basics of biology. It's got photosynthesis and human physiology and cell division and Darwinism. And after Darwinism, it goes into sterilizing the poor and good old-fashioned white supremacy. Poor people take from society, but they give nothing in return. They are true parasites. If such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. At the present time, there exists upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. And finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. And what strikes Darrow is that he's a lawyer, and he recognizes that we simultaneously inhabit a naturalistic world of ape ancestors and a cultural or moral universe of inequality and injustice. And somehow, biologists are so concerned about the former that they have totally lost sight of the latter. And not only that, but if you're going to lose sight of one of those, that's the wrong one. Darrow is defending a book that has evolution, but he's also defending a book that has white supremacy and eugenics. And immediately after the Scopes trial, Clarence Darrow evolves from being the defender of biology to being a basher of biology. And the very same biologists who he had been defending a few months ago for their views about fossil fish, he now excoriates for their views about living people. Never one to understate a case, he concludes his essay on the cult of eugenics thusly. Amongst the schemes for remolding society, this is the most senseless and impudent that has ever been put forward by irresponsible fanatics to plague a long-suffering race. Darrow publishes his essay in the literary magazine edited by his friend H.L. Mencken, played by Gene Kelly in the movie, at a time when no biologist in America has said anything at all like this. You have a few polite critical comments by the fruit fly biologist Thomas Hunt Morgan, who worked in Schermerhorn Hall at Columbia in the same building as Franz Boas, who had been crapping on the eugenicists for years. But the eugenicists are the majority of biologists, and Boas is just an anthropologist. This is the Advisory Council of the American Eugenics Society in 1927. Let's take a look at the officers of the American Eugenics Society, especially the geneticists in red. Charles Davenport, its vice president. Well, Irving Fisher, in the middle there, was an economist at Yale, who is best known today for having predicted in September of 1929 that the stock market would go up forever. Madison Grant was a leading racist author of the age, bearing the name of not one but 2 presidents. Harry Laughlin was a geneticist much admired by the Nazis, who framed their Nuremberg laws after laws that he had written in the United States. C.C. Little was a geneticist. That's geneticists in red. We'll get to them in just a second. But Little was the president of the University of Michigan and founded what is now a highly respectable mouse genetics laboratory in Maine at Bar Harbor. Kind of a funny footnote. Since he thought that all cancer was genetic, he made a lot of money as a paid spokesman for the tobacco industry, insisting that smoking doesn't cause cancer. Below them, this large advisory council included the names of nearly every geneticist of note in the United States. The point is that this is not a pseudo-scientific movement. This is very much a mainstream scientific movement. From left to right, Castle from Harvard, Conklin from Princeton, East from Harvard, Geyer from Wisconsin, Holmes from Stanford, Newman from Chicago, Shull from Michigan, Walter from Brown, Woods from MIT, and even young Sewell Wright from the University of Chicago. This is a who's who of the field of genetics in 1927. And all of these geneticists are serving under Madison Grant. Look him up. The point is that eugenics was mainstream science, even if some non-scientists were able to identify its central ideas as baloney. Not only Clarence Darrow, but H.L. Mencken himself, whose searing prose about the Scopes trial is still fun to read today, had little to say in favor of the scientists' social policies. He called eugenics blather in the pages of the Baltimore Sun, and took the geneticists to task for their casual assessments of other people's general worth. There may be, at the very top, a small class of persons whose blood is decidedly superior and distinguished, and there may be, at the bottom, another class whose blood is almost wholly debased, but both are very small. The folks between are all pretty much alike. But still in 1927, no geneticist is out there publicly challenging the eugenics movement, because to do so would be to position yourself as anti-science. Finally, in 1927, the first American geneticist to call bullshit on the eugenics movement is Raymond Pearl of Johns Hopkins, where, in the same literary magazine edited by his buddy and fellow Baltimorean H.L. Mencken, and it's picked up by the news services. For the first time, there is a public revolt among biologists, obviously not over evolution itself, but about evolution's possible implications for human society. I mean, are our descendants really going to be overrun by genetic morons and criminals because those are the ones out breeding the good citizens? Or is that dire Darwinian warning simply blather? Well, here's the thought I want to leave you with. Raymond Pearl was no saint, but after this essay came out, Harvard quietly withdrew the offer it had made to poach him from Johns Hopkins. There was indeed a professional risk attached to challenging the social politics of the biologists. After all, by the time Raymond Pearl's article came out, and followed a few years later by a famous address by the geneticist Herman Muller, they were a day late and $1 short. Immigration restriction was passed in 1924, and involuntary sterilization was legalized by the Supreme Court in 1927. Those were the top two items on the eugenics wish list. The people who actually publicly opposed eugenics in the 1920s, unsuccessfully as it turned out, had to position themselves as anti-science, and they were a weird coalition. First, you have the social scientists like Franz Boas, who could see that the geneticists were fundamentally misunderstanding the social basis of crime and poverty. Next, you have the civil libertarians like Clarence Darrow, who didn't like the idea of the state intruding upon private matters and mutilating its citizenry. Third, you had the Catholics, who were opposed to human interference with the divine business of reproduction. Fourth, you had the Lamarckians, who believed that education and upward mobility were good for the human species, but couldn't explain how such things could affect our germplasm. And finally, political conservatives, because eugenics was in fact a progressive political movement. Eugenicists wanted to change the country and the world for the better, scientifically. That's literally what conservatives are against. And the people who were for eugenics? Mendel, Darwin, science. That's why you couldn't find a single biologist in America speaking out critically of the eugenics movement until 1927, when it's too late. So that's my lesson for the Scopes Centennial. It can't be up to the non-scientists to create the intellectual space within which to accept the history of life, but also to reject the social and political agendas that ride its coattails. It's got to be up to the scientists themselves. Yeah, that's right. I'm talking to you, evolutionary psychology.